The Seattle Seahawks finished the 2024 season with a 10-7 record and missed the playoffs for the second straight year. It was an up-and-down season for the Seahawks as they started the year 3-0, then lost 3 games to fall to 3-3 before eventually having an 8-7 record through 15 games, then proceeded to win the final 2 games of the year to finish 10-7. It was an unfortunate season for Seattle in a lot of ways because 10 wins, more often than not, will at least get you into the playoffs as a wild card team, but 2024 was a really abnormal year as the NFC North had 2 teams with 14 plus wins and another with 11 wins, and the NFC East had 2 teams with 12 plus wins too. There were a couple of games Seattle lost that they certainly would have liked to have had back, but unfortunately it was too little too late. And entering the 2025 offseason, they were at a pivotal point because they could keep trying with the roster they had, or they could acknowledge both age and money were going to complicate things in a big way. And the Seahawks made several big moves this offseason and in a lot of ways completely changed their roster, but they are doing everything right and are taking steps in the right direction. And in today's video, we're going to discuss the steps they're taking, what their team will look like in 2025 and beyond, and why this is going to be a very difficult team to beat for the next few years. Now let's begin. And we are starting today's video by discussing what dilemma the Seahawks had entering the 2025 offseason, and it was what to do with Geno Smith and DK Metcalf. Geno nor DK are bad players, obviously, and there were a lot of upset Seahawks fans when they made the Geno trade, and I get it. But Geno will turn 35 in October, and Mike Macdonald is a second-year head coach, and I always thought there was going to be a tough decision regarding Geno at some point, due in large part to his age, and the only question was when. Now, there are other 34 or even 35 plus year old quarterbacks that have played at a high level in the history of the NFL, but with a head coach entering his second season, I thought he would want to have a chance at taking a swing on a quarterback of his own, and pretty much at the snap of a finger, Geno Smith became a Raider, and that was that. My biggest thing with Geno was, while I acknowledge he was a good quarterback that would have not just a game or two, but even several games of good play in a row, when you ask the simple question of do you think at some point during his time in Seattle, is he going to win a Super Bowl, fair or not, because there are a tremendous amount of factors that go into that question, I thought the answer was no. DK Metcalf was another situation entirely, and while I do think DK is a good receiver, giving him a 4-year $132 million contract extension is pretty steep, knowing you have Jackson Smith-Njigba coming up pretty quickly for a big payday too. Now, I know when DK was traded to the Steelers, it was reported as a 5-year $150 million contract, but he had 1 year and $18 million left on his deal, and the Steelers gave him a 4 for $132 extension, so if you were wondering, that's where the 5 for $150 number came into play. So for Seattle to acquire a top 55 pick for Metcalf, a player they had no interest in paying, and to also acquire a top 100 selection for an aging quarterback that clearly was not in your long-term plans, I thought was a great start to the offseason. I know some people wanted more in a trade for Geno Smith, but if there is any consolation, they selected my 65th ranked player in the draft in Jalen Milroe with the pick they acquired in the Geno Smith trade, which was number 92 overall. The Seahawks getting a plus 27 value was great for them for a dart throw at the end of the 3rd round on a very unique quarterback prospect, and we'll get more into Jalen Milroe in a minute, but I am always a fan of moving on from guys a year early rather than a year late. Oftentimes we see franchises move on too late, and before you know it, the player is nowhere close to the guy they once were, and the franchise ends up paying the said player a lot of money for not a lot of production. And at the end of the day, remember, the NFL is a business. And I know some people have strong opinions on Sam Darnold, but I couldn't be happier for the Seahawks to sign Darnold, given the situation they are currently in as a franchise with the contract they gave him. He signed a 3-year $100 million deal, and obviously if he plays to the level he did for most of 2024, that contract will be a steal for Seattle, because this is a guy who just threw for over 4,300 yards and 35 touchdowns and won 14 games as a starting quarterback. Darnold also finished 10th in MVP voting and had a spectacular season and a resurgence in his career. But if he sees ghosts and reverts back to the player he was during his time with the Jets, then Seattle will be out of the contract fairly quickly, and that'll be that. One of the biggest things about not just the Seahawks, but for several other NFL franchises too, is they are getting a hell of a lot smarter in terms of contracts they give out in free agency, and the contract the Seahawks gave Sam Darnold is a perfect example of this. And Seattle obviously had a tremendous draft class too, and we'll get to that in a minute, but I do want to take a second to talk to you about today's sponsor, Penalty Verdict. This applies to all football fans because I think we've all felt at some point in our lives, maybe multiple times in our lives, that our team is the victim of bad officiating and that we've had several calls not go in our favor. And what Penalty Verdict allows us fans to do is vote on the refs' calls in real time. This isn't just exclusive to the NFL either, as you can vote on penalty calls in real time for college football games as well, and ultimately engage with a community of football fans that desire both fair play and accountability. Obviously, the way we've watched sports over the past several years has changed due in some part to technology, but you can unlock the next dimension of sports by engaging with real-time polling of players, refs, and teams, and one of my favorite parts about Penalty Verdict is how data-driven it is so you can have informed discussions about the game. Penalty Verdict is in its development phase, and they'd love to hear feedback from you, whether that's through the pinned comment or the link in the description. And if there is one thing we can all agree on as football fans, it's that we love fair play. And if there's a certain feature within the app that you'd like to share with Penalty Verdict, they would love to hear it. So once again, go visit the link in the description or the pinned comment, and a big thank you to Penalty Verdict for sponsoring today's video. Now, regarding the Seahawks 2025 draft class, they were one of only a couple of teams to receive an A+ draft grade, and generally with my grades, I really try and reserve the A+s for maybe 2 or 3 teams for an entire draft, because even if a team does good and they go a little above and beyond, you still want to have that buffer between an A and an A+. So there were several teams that had good drafts, like the Cowboys and the Bears and the Ravens and the Bucs, but I did not give any of those teams an A+ draft grade like I did with Seattle, Carolina, and New England. And for Seattle, it started with the selection of Gray Zabel. And watching Seattle's interior offensive line in 2024, not just for a game or two, but throughout the year, was very frustrating at times. Whether it was Laken Tomlinson, Anthony Bradford, or 6th round pick Satoa Lauamea from the 2024 class, it was downright frustrating to watch Geno Smith have to go through that week after week after week. And whether the quarterback last year, and we go back to a point we made earlier in the video about the question of whether Geno Smith would ever win a Super Bowl in Seattle, not necessarily being a fair question to him, the reality, to me at least, was whether the quarterback was Geno last year or Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, Joe Burrow, Jalen Hurts, whoever, I don't think any of those quarterbacks would have won a Super Bowl in Seattle with how bad the interior offensive line was. So for Seattle to walk out of night one of the draft with a player in Gray Zabel who I think is going to be at minimum a quality starter for not just the next 2 or 3 years, but probably the next 5 or 6 years, and knowing that they had 4 other top 100 picks in their back pocket entering day 2, as long as Seattle didn't significantly reach for a round 5 or 6 player with their 2nd or 3rd round picks, they were going to have a good draft. They set the standard on night 1, and they traded up from pick 50 to pick 35 on night 2 to go get South Carolina safety Nick Emanwari. Emanwari, to me, is a really scheme-specific player, and a guy that, had he went to a bad situation, I would have been a little weary of how he was going to play at the NFL, but this is not a situation where I have any concerns with Emanwari. Yes, he's going to struggle at times, and he's going to have some rookie moments, I'm sure, whether it's a lapse in coverage or whether it's not picking up a run fit or whatever the case may be. I don't want to paint a picture that he's going to be this perfect player, but I really love the idea of Nick Emanwari going to Seattle and playing in Mike McDonald's defense for the next couple of years. I was admittedly a little lower on Elijah Arroyo than the consensus, or the national media if you will, but at the end of the day, I still think he could be a solid pass-catching tight end that hauls in anywhere from 40 to 50 receptions a year, and at the end of the day, does his job at a high level. And ultimately, they drafted Jalen Milroe with their 4th pick in the draft, and this is another selection that, like we said with the Emanwari, I was going to be a little weary of where he went, but I think this is a perfect situation for Jalen Milroe for a couple of reasons, and this is also why I love the 2025 Seahawks draft class. Now, when we say the Seattle Seahawks are doing everything right, I truly believe they are from a franchise and from a process standpoint, and it relates directly to the Jalen Milroe pick. They entered the offseason with having Geno Smith and DK Metcalf both on the roster, and they looked themselves in the mirror and basically said, hey, we can run it back with Geno and DK and everybody else and win anywhere from 9 to 10 to 11 games, maybe make the playoffs, and probably lose in the wild card round, as that's probably not going to be enough to win the division. Or we can make the hard decision and trade both players away and try and rebuild with what we have, which is already a solid roster in place. How this relates to the Jalen Milroe situation is they also signed Sam Darnold this offseason, and if in the scenario Sam Darnold works out for the Seahawks, the way Baker Mayfield has for the Buccaneers, then they have their franchise quarterback for the next several years because, remember, despite Sam Darnold being in the league for seemingly forever now, he is just 28 years old, and if he does not work out, then they have Jalen Milroe developing behind him, hoping that he can be the long-term guy, and if neither player work out, then they can select a quarterback in the first round in what would probably be 2027. But why I like the Jalen Milroe selection so much is because he is the definition of a developmental quarterback. Now, when you hear the word developmental quarterback, you think of a guy that may work out in a couple of years and hope that he does, and if he doesn't, oh well, we'll just take a guy a couple of years from now. But Jalen Milroe is also a player that should see the field pretty regularly in 2025. Whether it's 3rd and 2 from the 45-yard line or 4th and goal from the 3-yard line, Jalen Milroe should see a decent amount of playing time this year for Seattle. And with having Jalen Milroe on the roster, he should force opposing franchises and opposing defensive coordinators to spend time throughout the week having to game plan against the threat of him being on the field. He is a playmaker with the ball in his hands, and if Jalen Milroe does not work out, I do not say this lightly because this is the type of respect I have for him with the ball in his hands. He could legitimately be an NFL running back in a couple of years if quarterback does not work out for him. That's how good he is with the football in his hands. And also having Jalen Milroe on the roster, to me, signals to Sam Darnold that, hey buddy, we just selected a developmental quarterback in the 3rd round at 92 overall, a player that, by the way, I had 65 on my board, so that was a plus 27 value for the Seahawks, and if you don't perform, and if you don't live up to the contract that you signed, we have a backup plan just in case emergency break glass. So I like the Jalen Milroe selection all across the board, and he also played into why Seattle had such a good draft class. This is a guy that should help red zone efficiency in a big way for Seattle in 2025, and if Seattle finishes anywhere below 10th in red zone touchdown percentage this year, I would be pretty disappointed, all things considered. I also really like the selections of Torrey Horton and Damian Martinez on day 3, and for Seattle to only have 4 top 100 selections, yet walk out of the 2025 draft with 6 top 100 players on my board, was pretty much the reason they received an A+ draft grade. This was all around a masterclass by John Schneider, and I can't wait to see how they implement not only Grace Abel at left guard, but Elijah Arroyo at tight end, Nicky Manwari in a scheme-specific role at safety, and of course, Jalen Milroe in his rookie season. To get back to free agency and what Seattle did during free agency by not only bringing in Sam Darnold, but by also bringing in Cooper Kupp and DeMarcus Lawrence, to me was a really good allocation of assets with where they currently are. Cooper Kupp had 710 yards last year and was not a bad player when he played. Now, his last 1,000-yard season was back in 2021 when he won the Triple Crown and was the Offensive Player of the Year. But why I specifically like this signing is because the situation for him in Seattle isn't all that different from what he had in Los Angeles. There's a couple of different variables, of course, but he has a younger receiver in front of him, Jackson Smith-Njigba, and he also has a good quarterback throwing him passes and a good ground game too in Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet. And to go back to the point we made earlier in terms of teams getting smarter with contracts they give out, Kupp signed a 3-year, $45 million deal this offseason, and whenever we discuss contracts on the channel, the first thing you should look for in contracts is the guarantees. There's a very low chance Kupp actually plays this contract out because only 17.5 of the 45 was guaranteed, and again, that's what matters within the contracts, is guarantees. Kupp would be 34 years old in the final year of his deal, where he would be scheduled to make $18 million, and given that Kupp has only played in 12 games once in the past 3 years, leads me to believe he probably won't play 17 games this year, and that this is essentially a 1-year deal. And if he does play all 17 games and goes for 1,000 yards for what would be the 3rd time in his career, then it's a win-win for everyone. But why I also like this signing for Seattle is I think it's a floor-raising player entering a team that just won double-digit games. And even in the worst case he doesn't work out, they still sign Marquez Valdes-Scantling to a 1-year, $4 million deal, who didn't play bad for New Orleans last year and can be your vertical threat to stretch the defense. I wouldn't expect much from a statistical impact from MVS due to having JSN, Cooper Kupp, both running backs, and even Noah Fant Bryant and Elijah Arroyo in the same offense, but I do like the idea of him being on the field to at least be accounted for and keep the defense honest, especially for a team that I think will try to run the ball more in 2025 than they did in 2024. Seattle also very quietly had 5 players with 45 or more pressures in 2024, and because of the low-risk signing DeMarcus Lawrence to what could very easily be a one-year deal if he does not pan out, I also like the signing too because of what it represents for Seattle. I like Mike Macdonald a lot as a defensive-minded coach, and I can't wait to see how the Seahawks defense plays in 2025 as we continue to progress in the Macdonald era. This was a defense that allowed 30 points just once in the final 9 games of the 2024 season, compared to 3 separate times in the first 8 games of the season. This was a unit that got better as the year went on, and when Macdonald was the Ravens defensive coordinator in 2023, a lot of the players praised how complex his defense was, yet how easy it was to learn, which is a very complicated thing to do. And these were quotes from guys like Marlon Humphrey and Kyle Hamilton, who of course are very good at what they do. And I am a firm believer that what we saw from Seattle in 2024 was really a baseline for what we should expect moving forward. I mean, in year 1 of having Macdonald as their head coach, they went from 25th in points allowed per game in 2023 to 11th in points allowed per game in 2024. Leonard Williams also had the best year of his career under Macdonald, similar to how Nnamdi Madubuike did for the Ravens in 2023, and I don't think that's a coincidence. And with another year of progression, along with everyone in the organization buying in, and combined with the fact this team already won double-digit games last year, well, from an organizational perspective, they truly are doing everything the right way. The one big variable we don't know is how will Sam Darnold play in 2025? Will we receive the Sam Darnold that threw for over 30 touchdowns last year and played well through weeks 1 through 17? Really minus the one Jags game, as that game gets kind of dismissed because the Vikings ended up winning and the Jags finished with a top 5 pick, although Sam Darnold played really bad in that game, and as we know that he did not play well against the Lions in week 18, in a game the Vikings would lose by 20 plus points, or the following week against his now division rival Rams in a game that the Vikings would go on to lose by 18 points with the season on the line. But my biggest fear for Seattle entering the 2025 offseason was that they were going to run it back with Geno and DK and everybody else, and they were probably going to win anywhere from 9 to 10 or 11 games, even in their best, and probably lose in the wildcard round to take your choosing of either the Eagles, Lions, 49ers, Rams, Buccaneers, maybe even the Commanders, and you get the point. But they didn't. They addressed everything and got everything out of the way before it even got started. That was my biggest fear, running it back with a 35-year-old quarterback and a receiver that would have been disgruntled because he didn't have the long-term security, and as we know now, was not going to receive the long-term security from the Seattle Seahawks. But to address the interior offensive line with a very good player in round 1, and to at minimum, in my personal opinion, walk out of this class with at least 2, if not 3 starters in Elijah Arroyo, Nicky Minwari, and Gray Zabel, and potentially a developmental quarterback in Jalen Milroe, and day 3 steals in Torrey Horton and Damian Martinez, as well as bringing in guys like Sam Darnold, Cooper Kupp, and DeMarcus Lawrence this offseason the way they did. Guys, the Seattle Seahawks are doing everything right. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please like and subscribe, as it helps the channel tremendously, and it also helps the almighty YouTube algorithm, and I truly cannot thank you guys enough for the support. So until next time, as always, please be safe, and have a great day. Love you guys.